that in any mathematical object upon which feedbacks operate, if the feedback loop gain, which I will define in a minute, exceeds 0.1, then the object will become unstable. And we know that the climate object, in temperature terms, has remained formidably stable throughout the last billion years. In fact, over all that time, the temperature has varied by only 3%, or 9 Celsius, above or below the mean temperature for a billion years. Now, that's quite enough to send you from ice ages back into hothouse planet and then back to roughly where we are now. We are about in the middle of that range. But, therefore, the climate is stable. Therefore, the loop gain from any positive feedbacks that are there in net terms cannot exceed 0.1. Otherwise, we couldn't have had this stable climate. And certainly, the loop gain could not possibly, by any stretch of the imagination, be as high as 0.42 to 0.74, you see that above the red zone, which is the IPCC's central temperature predictions. It could not be that high. That is a physical impossibility. And that is based on the IPCC's estimates that the amount of warming we're going to get for a doubling of CO2 ranges between 2 and 4.5 Celsius. And that is perhaps the best reason for saying we're just not going to get anything like the warming they predict, because it is actually a physical impossibility. The only zone in which you could get a realistic temperature increase is in the green little narrow box at the bottom, and you can see that goes up only to 0.1 as your feedback. And you could have negative feedbacks and the climate remains stable. But excessive net positive feedbacks, it could not remain stable. It will eventually go roaring up the graph there to the singularity in the equation with a loop gain of 1. A loop gain, what is it? If I took this microphone and held it near one of the speakers, it would begin shrieking. If I took it closer still and turned up the amplifier, it would blow the circuit. That is a feedback loop gain that's got out of hand and it's gone towards the singularity in the equation. And the circuit blows up. It becomes terminally unstable, as our climate would have done at some time in the last billion years if these feedbacks or anything like them had been prevalent in the climate. So we know it isn't going to happen to the degree that they're trying to tell us it is. Well, now the next question then is, let's pretend that everything I've just told you is wrong. Because these are calculations, they've been done by eminent scientists, they've been done by eminent climatologists, some of them have even been done by me. So they really are right. But let's suppose they're wrong. Let's suppose that in fact the official position is right, and we are going to get 3.3 Celsius, 3.4 Celsius for a doubling of CO2 concentration by the end of this century. Let's pretend. Because that's the basis on which your government has brought in its ETS scheme. Okay, so how much warming will an ETS actually prevent? Well, the first question we need to address, which is what we call the limiting case in mathematics, is what is the maximum amount of warming that we could forestall if we shut down the planet altogether and said, right, no more global warming at all. No more CO2 emitted at all. From today, turn off the lights, turn off the microphone. Nothing. No more hospitals, no more trains, planes, automobiles, nothing. No industry, no rights. Not even, as we go back into the Stone Age, the right to light a carbon-emitting fire in your cave. Then the amount of warming you would forestall, taking the IPCC central estimate of how much warming would be caused, is 1.7 Celsius. That's if the whole world shut down today, and you wait until the end of the century. That's how much warming you would forestall. Rather, that is all the warming you would forestall. So, we now look at Australia's ETS, because I can get better figures for that than I can from your obscurantist government here about what your ETS is doing and how much it's costing and how much global warming they're hoping to make go away. Australia has been very explicit about it, and therefore I'm going to use their figures, because if anything, your scheme is even less cost-effective than theirs. So you can take their scheme, if you like, as the upper limiting case for your scheme. And indeed, the two are going to be harmonised, as you know, so this is therefore quite relevant to you as well. Now, Australia is aiming to cut over the next 10 years 5% of her emissions, which account themselves for 1.2% of global emissions. That means that their stated target, even if they achieved it, which they won't, because everybody's being compensated, so nobody has any disincentive to emit, is going to be 0.06% of total global emissions. That's the entire amount that would be remitted if Australia's scheme succeeded over a period of 10 years. Now, you have only about a 1/12 of Australia's emissions. So you can imagine how little effect you're going to have. We could wipe both you and Australia off the map today, and nobody could tell in 100 years' time from the temperature record whether you'd gone or were still there. So, sorry about that. I don't want to wipe you off the map, but it really wouldn't make any difference to global warming if we said bye-bye New Zealand and bye-bye Australia. So, 0.06% of total global emissions is the actual implicit, though of course nobody has actually stated this, the implicit target of this project over the next 10 years. So, first of all, what would this do to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which would otherwise be around 412 parts per million by volume, according to the IPCC? Well, you'll be delighted to hear that it is going to make a difference. It's going to bring that concentration down from 412, as it otherwise would have been, to 411.987. And this, in turn, will forestall, once again, it does forestall global warming. It will forestall less than 0.00007 Celsius. 1/14,000th of a Celsius degree, 1/700th of the minimum threshold below which no modern method or instrument can measure that there has been any reduction in global temperature at all. In short, even if this policy succeeds, they will have no way of measuring that it has. So, here's the cost, 130 billion over the next 10 years. And if we then work out how much it would cost to forestall 1 Celsius of global warming, using methods all around the world, just as cost ineffective as those in Australia and by implication New Zealand, then you'll be pleased to hear it's a bargain basement price of $1.8 quadrillion per Celsius degree forestalled. Or if we bring it down to a more human scale and say, well, all right, how much will it forestall of the 0.23 Celsius predicted to occur of global warming by the IPCC over the next 10 years? Then it's going to cost you $60,000 per head of the world's population, doing this worldwide, which is in turn about 60% of global GDP, everything we make and produce and sell, over the whole of the next 10 years. Sir, I'll have your $60,000 check now, please.
No, I want it back.
He says he wants it back. Well, sorry, mate. This is what your government wants to do to you. We have a technical term for it, but I don't think in a family meeting I can possibly say, oh, here, go ahead. So, what then is the cost of doing nothing? Because as Whangarei says in his otherwise laughable report on the economics of climate change, we do need to compare the cost of action, which we now know to be 60% of GDP, with the cost of sitting back doing nothing in the sunshine. So here we go. Now Stern, in his report of 2006, preceding Whangarei by a couple of years, he was told by the British government the result we want is we want it to be plainly shown that it's much more expensive to do nothing and take the damage that would result than it is to take action now. So Stern said, yes sir, certainly sir, at once sir, touch forelock sir. And off he went. And he did 3 things. First of all, he said, we're not going to get 3.3, 3.4 Celsius of warming, as the supposed IPCC consensus tells us. No, we're going to get 5 Celsius of warming. And he took that as his central case. 50% above the IPCC's already, as we've seen, probably wildly exaggerated 3.3 Celsius. Then, he wildly exaggerated the amount of damage, and therefore the cost of that damage, that would be caused by that amount of warming in this century. And then, as if those 2 huge exaggerations were not enough, he then used 0.1% pure rate of time preference discount rate for his intergenerational appraisal of whether it was better for us to spend the money now or to leave it to our grandkids to clean up our mess afterwards. Right. How many of you have ever heard any of your news media telling you what an intertemporal pure rate of time preference discount rate is and why it is important in economic considerations of whether to have an ETS or not? I do not see a single hand rising. Now, I used to do these appraisals for Her Majesty's Treasury when I worked for Margaret Thatcher in 10 Downing Street. They would do them rather badly, and I would do them better, to their astonishment, because I had a computer on my desk, and they didn't. I had the first computer ever seen inside Number 10. I carried it in with me. It weighed 18 pounds, but it was just about portable. or luggable as the word was in those days. And here then, what Stern has done is he's done these three exaggerations, which lead to making it look as though it's actually a lot cheaper to act now than it would be to do nothing. Now, what I've done is I've said, all right, let us assume, for the purpose of argument, for the sake of being agreeable, that his 50% exaggeration of the temperature change we're likely to see this century caused by us, let's assume that that's correct. Let's assume that his vast exaggerations of the amount of damage and cost that that would cause are also correct. But let us just make one adjustment, and that is not the 0.1% discount rate that he uses, but the 5% discount rate, which would be regarded as normal in the industrial appraisals of future investments against present investments. And that would be 5%, which is the minimum real rate of return on capital. You would not use less than 5%. And hooray, the cost of doing nothing comes down from 5 to 20% of GDP, as imagined by Stern, to 0.4 to 1.5% of GDP. In other words, nothing worth worrying about, and even those figures, remember, are exaggerated. So, we now compare that with the cost of doing something. The cost of doing something, remember, was about 60% of GDP. Cost of doing nothing, even if you take the maximum cost of doing nothing, even if it's exaggerated by Stern, 1.5% of GDP, it's at least 40 times more expensive to take action via ETSs all around the world than it is to do nothing. This, I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, as somebody very experienced in doing this kind of calculation at a very senior level in government, I have never seen an investment appraisal produce a result quite as catastrophic as this. There is absolutely no basis whatsoever economically for taking any action at all today to make global warming go away. You do not need an ETS scheme. It is simply totally unnecessary. So we could look at the world's record wind farm. 28% of GDP would be gobbled up to prevent the global warming the IPCC imagines would happen over the next 20 years, which is the lifetime of that wind farm, the Thanet wind array, which is going to receive, believe it or not, for this one wind farm, a $2 billion subsidy by the British taxpayer over the next 20 years. If you think you're unlucky, think of us. Then there's the Europeans' ETS scheme. That's also going to cost about 29% of GDP. And that is making some very favourable assumptions about how much it's actually costing us. It's costing a great deal more than this, but again, I'm doing my best to be as kind to them as I can, and still the figures are absurdly higher than the absolute maximum cost of doing nothing, which is 1.5% of GDP. And in any case, we are not the problem. China is now the problem because it's going to open 1 or 2 new coal-fired power stations every week between now and 2030. Do not believe a word you hear from the Xinhua news agency, or for that matter, from the silver tongue of the Chinese foreign minister, who has been speaking out about New Zealand on the television this morning. What they're actually going to do is to vastly increase their CO2 emissions, and rightly so, because the cheapest way to bring your people out of poverty and thereby to stabilise their populations is to raise their standard of living by giving them coal-fired electricity, because that is the cheapest form of electricity in the world. And Australia, by the way, is that little green line at the bottom, and the little black, thin, straight line below that, that's New Zealand. And here's the Kyoto Protocol. If every country had complied with it, this would have forestalled 0.2 of the absolute maximum 1.7 Celsius that could have been forestalled this century if we'd shut the whole of the world down today. But in fact, nobody has complied with it fully, most have hardly complied with it at all, and the actual best estimate I can make of the temperature savings from having done the Kyoto Protocol at a cost of $2 trillion and counting worldwide is 0.000 Celsius. So then what about the political cost? Now, it has been said in your newspapers that I am a rabid conspiracy theorist. And the reason why is that 2 years ago I revealed the existence of this treaty, the Copenhagen Draft Treaty of the 15th of September 2009.